Hello, this is Mark Tooley, editor of Providence, a journal of Christianity and American foreign policy, with the pleasure of commencing a new episode of Marksism with fellow editors and fellow Marks, Mark Melton and Mark Leibecke, addressing three pieces from Providence this week, one of which is a reflection on the resurrection and Easter from the wife of our patron Saint Reinhold Niebuhr. She is Ursula Niebuhr. A piece by Mark Leibecke, which responds to another piece we published by our friend at Wheaton College, advocating or reflecting on pacifism and the Ukraine. Mark Leibecke, of course, defends the just war tradition in that regard. And then finally, a piece by our regular contributor, Debra Erickson, on why the Ukraine conflict is not World War III. But first, we'll go to Mark Leibecke to share with us about his exchange with our pacifist friend at Wheaton. Mark Leibecke, go.
Yeah, thanks. Good to be here. Have a good Friday. Michael McCoy, political scientist, political theorist at Wheaton College, offered us sort of a rebuttal, I suppose, or maybe not even a rebuttal, but a response to the probably many articles that we've been writing on Ukraine, but in particular your own on idealism, realism, and I think pacifism. I can't remember the three bits of that. But he takes up the sort of challenge to provide a pacifist answer to the crisis in Ukraine. What I like about what he did, and I think it's somewhat novel, is he doesn't provide so much a theological response. He tries to root pacifism in political science, which is a bit on the surface surprising, if not kind of absurd, in that most political theorists dismiss out of hand pacifism as a viable option in foreign relations. Very often you'll see political theorists cast, say, realism on one side and just war on the other, as if these are the two poles, simply because they dismiss out of hand pacifism. But he takes up the challenge of offering a political scientist grounding for pacifism. And one of the ways he does that is to reference what's known as the bargaining model of war, which takes a very scientific view of human conflict and tries to figure out how human conflict can actually be rational. And it comes up somewhat befuddled because it says, well, look, on the surface of it, if you look at human conflict, it seems clear that it is always to both parties' advantage, both conflicting parties' advantage, to find some alternative to war, that war is never the most materially advantageous thing that a conflicting party can do. And so therefore, the only explanation for why anybody would ever go into war in the first place would probably be misunderstanding, miscalculating one another's abilities to fight a war. I might think that I could just roll over, say, the Ukraine, and it turns out, in fact, that I can't. So that was a miscalculation. And had I had a firm grasp of their real ability to fight, I would never launch the fight. Or I misunderstand their willingness to fight in the first place, then I'm probably really committed. So it's just a miscalculation, because if we had all the information we need, we would all clearly see that there must be some materially more advantageous thing than going into war. So I think that's a reasonable summary of one of his primary points. And I find that mystifying, frankly. And in my piece, I cite a couple of reasons why. First, on the surface, just taking up the argument about materiality to begin with, it seems to me self-evident that if actually what you want from me is everything I possess, then it is to my material advantage to resist that. And there are certain things that I simply can't negotiate away because I'll lose everything. But more importantly than that, it's a bizarre assertion that because there might be a materially more advantageous alternative to combat, that therefore I must take that more materially advantageous alternative to combat. That ignores the fact that we live in a world in which the things we most highly value are not, strictly speaking, always material. And so it discounts the fact that there may be all sorts of moral reasons, normative reasons why people fight, and that there are simply certain things that we cannot negotiate. My children are material, I grant that, but the love that I have for them and the devotion that I have for them, if you come to my home and want to take my children, there is no more materially advantageous thing for me to do that would dissuade me from fighting for their lives. I would give up everything for that. And I know Mike knows this, and so I'm confused maybe by the real work that the bargaining model of war can really do. I think it's a good tool, one of many tools to try to explain human conflict, but as a grounding for pacifism, as some sort of efficacious response to human conflict, I don't think it takes into account human sin. I don't think it takes into account the fact that there's very often one side that is hell-bent on fighting no matter what. I think we see that in the situation in Ukraine. So I just find it absolutely dissatisfying as an alternative to the Christian realist perspective. So I think McCoy's piece, I think what it most successfully does is it stresses why the Christian aspect of Christian realism is so vital, because realism alone can't possibly account for the whole of human experience. And Christian realism begins to do that in a much better way.
Today, of course, is Good Friday as we prepare for Easter and its celebration of the resurrection. We posted this piece by Ursula Niebuhr on the resurrection, where she challenges conventional liberal Protestant perspectives of 80 years ago that minimized the supernatural and the transcendence of the resurrection, and offers up her more, I suppose, Christian realist perspective. Niebuhr himself, her husband, was a theological modernist for much, if not most, of his life. To the extent to which he believed in a physical resurrection, I don't know. And if anyone else has that answer, let me know. But her column implies that she believes in a physical resurrection, but she's concerned about focusing exclusively on what she calls immortality. But Mark Melton, maybe you can explain her perspective better.
Yeah, like I'm not sure exactly Niebuhr's or Reinhold Niebuhr's position on it. I remember seeing in some article that kind of questioned his thoughts on the resurrection. I know that his brother H. Richard Niebuhr, I think, was much more orthodox in his approach to the resurrection. But for Ursula, so the wife of Reinhold, she is writing this article. She's criticizing a couple of different sermons that apparently were common that she would hear. One focused on nature and the rebirth, and because spring is happening at the same time as Easter, and so it seemed like pastors were drawing that into their sermons a lot as like a main point. I don't hear that very often nowadays. I don't know if anyone else hears that, maybe as like a side note, but not as a main part of a sermon. She does also say that they are bringing up the hope of immortality a lot as the main focus. And immortality is not what I hear. I hear eternal life or everlasting life as part of like an Easter hope, or the what Easter means for Christians is that it gives us eternal life. But she says that what pastors should do is focus more on the meaning of death and the resurrection, and as a central part of the Easter message. And so in this, she talks about dying to self, and that if you don't focus in on these kind of like the death image, then she thinks that it can lead to what I describe as like a soft and slack Christianity. For instance, she writes, "We are anxious and want to save our life and keep it, so we do not launch into the deep to do different works in society and the world." And so in this, I think she does write as a theologian writing to fellow theologians when she's doing this. I'm right now finishing up a book review of Tim Keller's, if I can put this right, okay, Hope in Times of Fear, the Resurrection and the Meaning of Easter. And similar to Ursula, Tim Keller is saying that Christians need to focus a lot more on the resurrection part of Easter, and that sometimes it is kind of treated as like the miracle that proves that Jesus is the Son of God. And if Christians talk about the resurrection, they talk a lot about proof that it exists. And what he talks about is in this book is, he in the first chapter writes about, okay, yes, it did happen. But he then spends most of the book describing how does that affect how we live the rest of our life. And so in this, he talks about inaugurated eschatology. So the idea of the already, but the not yet, which for a lot of Providence articles that when they talk about some of the theology, that's in there a lot of the Providence pieces. And so I think what Keller is bringing up here is a very Christian realist view, especially in the last couple of chapters that are talking about how, it's a rejection of utopianism. It is a rejection of despair and very bad or total pessimism. And it is a rejection of the secular hope, which basically tries to take God out of the equations. Keller is putting original sin back into the calculation. Like, you cannot forget that original sin still exists post-resurrection. But because of the resurrection, because of Christ's victory over death, there is hope that the world can and is improving, not immediately, gradually, not continually in an upward trajectory, but it is improving in ways that we should not underestimate. And so I think Keller's probably, granted, it's a book, so it's going to take longer to read than Ursula's, 800 or so word article. But I think he does a better job of explaining the entirety of it. But, it's still interesting to go back to a 75-year-old piece that is responding to different theological debates that we're not necessarily having today, like the emphasis on, the nature aspect of Easter. I don't hear that, like I said. But
well, if you grew up in a more liberal mainline background, you would have been more accustomed to Easter sermons that equated with flower blossoms in springtime.
Yeah.
But moving on to our final piece by Debra Erickson, just very briefly, in which she disputes the assumption by some that the Ukraine war is, by definition, World War III. There are, of course, those who are perhaps could be called neoconservative, who would jump to that conclusion to justify the more direct U.S. confrontation and conflict with Russia, with no-fly zones, et cetera. And there are those who are more isolationist who also would embrace this conclusion to warn off any kind of involvement and support for the Ukrainians. I think that Debra offers up a Christian realist perspective that most wars are, to some extent, localized or contained wars. They are not total wars, much less global wars, and that we should proceed with this realistic perspective that yes, we can and should help the Ukrainians while still holding back from a full-scale military confrontation with another great power. But just a few words from you, Mark Levesque.
I think that's right. I think that almost says everything that needs to be said. She says we got to get out of the habit of seeing every conflict as an existential fight against a totalitarian horror, that if we do not overcome it, then life as we know it will end. For the Ukrainians, that may be true, but from a sort of a grim, sober, prudent, realist perspective, it's not true. It's not true for us. We have a lot of reasons to fight for our friends, and we should do what we can, but we shouldn't make matters worse. So she provides, as you say, an alternative, if not a mean, between two extremes.
On that note, have a blessed and reflective Good Friday and a joyous Easter. Thank you for listening to this latest episode of Marksism. Till next week, bye-bye.